Hi there. Today we'll be very much discussing sort of the darker side of Hinduism when we talk about Hindu fundamentalism and the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. Now, you should also have watched or are soon to watch Ram Ke Naam, which is a documentary about the destruction of the Babri Masjid in the 1990s. It's a fantastic documentary. It is in Hindi, but it's subtitled, and the subtitles are quite accurate. All right, so let's get started. So, what is nationalism? Let's look at a couple of root terms here. Nationalism is when one's own nation or group that one is identified with is advanced to the detriment of other groups. So, when you say that your group or nation is better than all others, usually this is used with a sort of qualifier like Black nationalism, white nationalism, Scottish nationalism, and Hindu nationalism. So this is often negative. White nationalism argues that the USA is only for white folk, either expelling or ignoring non-whites or relegating non-whites to lower statuses in the world. This is often purely political in another sense. So Scottish nationalism, for instance, would support independence of Scotland over England. This is to say that there are lots of different types of nationalism. Often you'll see that nationalism will be a reaction against oppression. In this sense, it can be a good thing, such as Black nationalism in the USA supports unity and self-determination for Black people, especially in the form of creating a Black nation. Nationalism often has a populist bend. So this is different from having a popular tone. When I say populist, I mean it has an appeal to ordinary folks who feel their concerns are disregarded by the elites. When we're talking about Hindu nationalism, Hindu nationalists argue that the nation of India should be purely Hindu and should advance the sort of rights and concerns of Hindus over all other people. But who are the all other people? When in fact we see that the Hindu nationalism gobbles up Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs and say, you count as Hindus too, to which they would say, no, we don't. Hindu nationalism argues that it should be a Hindu government and an overtly Hindu government, and that overtly Hindu government should expel or at least completely dominate Muslims. So Muslims are the bugaboo of the Hindu nationalists. So when you hear people talk about nationalism, they'll often talk about communalism. Now, when I say communalism, I don't mean community per se, or people hanging around in a community or hanging around being communal. When I say communalism, I mean groups that value their own community, i.e., their own religious group, over the concerns of all other communities and all other religious groups. You'll also hear the phrase communal violence. This is violence committed by one group upon another, and arguing that their community is under threat or is the best, or that they must commit violence to protect their community. So communal violence is violence that is inspired by identity and identity conflicts. Now, we also have a thing called Indian nationalism. Now, Indian nationalism is different from Hindu nationalism in the same way that I could say American nationalism or USA nationalism is different from Christian nationalism or white nationalism. In Indian nationalism, the movement is to free India from the colonial rule of the British, to establish self-rule, which they have the handy Sanskrit term Swaraj, own rule, and to uplift all Indians, regardless of their religions. There's a desire for social welfare in Indian nationalism, a destruction of poverty, very modern views on religion that are very tolerant. The two figures I have selected on this slide are Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, not Muhammad Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, who was struggling for Indian independence against the British, and unfortunately got backed into a corner and was forced into acquiescing to the partition of India into several different countries, namely East and West Pakistan, East Pakistan became Bangladesh in 1971, and India proper. Then above him, I have Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda is important because he was the first Hindu to speak to the World Parliaments of Religions in the 1890s. Swami Vivekananda was profoundly an Indian nationalist, and despite being a Hindu himself, he was not a Hindu nationalist. He worked by traveling the world, raising funds by teaching religion in order to send back to India in order to prompt social reform, relief of the poor, and educating the country. So in many ways, he was the most prominent Indian nationalist. And for most of my time in India, and he's still regarded as being sort of like one of the greatest Indians of all time. He's a very interesting character. So Indian nationalism is secular. Now, I don't mean that it is non-religious, which is how Christians use secular. They say there's something that's religious and something that's secular. But what secular means in the context of the Indian government means that the government does not endorse any one particular religion. This is sort of like a government based on religious pluralism. So Indian nationalism roughly corresponds to the contemporary Indian political group called the Indian National Congress, or the INC. This is a religiously plural and secular political party that was in power for most of the years after independence and until the 90s. It pursued an agenda of secularism and caste reform. Lately, it has lost a lot of power because populist backlash has really, a lot of Hindus have bucked this secular party. It boasted as leaders many Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus. So this is Indian nationalism, India first, and all Indians count. Hindu nationalism is different from Indian nationalism. Hindu fundamentalists and Hindu nationalists are actually in charge of India right now. Here we see the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, and Yogi, what's his name again? Yogi Nath, I believe is his name, is a very prominent Hindu nationalist figure who has become very, very popular and powerful in the north and to sort of like the central north and northeast of India. Okay, in Hindu nationalism, India is for the Hindus. Any Indian originated religion is considered Hindus, i.e. Sikhism, Jainism, or Buddhism. The Hindu nationalists say, you're all Hindus, to which Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs say, no, we are not. The real concern they have is with Muslims. Hindu nationalism is really about getting rid of the Muslims and resisting Muslims in any way they can. Now, in the time of the British colonial presence in India, the British pursued a sort of policy of dividing and ruling. They actually set up different censuses that would make everyone have to declare their identity in a way that no people have done previously. Before the British, there was a lot of overlap between Muslim and Hindu practices, and they often shared the same saints. So what would happen is, as the British ruled, they would set up these censuses and say, are you a Hindu? Are you a Buddhist? Are you a Muslim? Are you a Jain? And usually people wouldn't think of themselves as Hindus. They would think of and they wouldn't think of themselves as being inherently different from these other groups. They would say, oh, I worship my clan god, my family god, and this saint in the area. And that's how I am religiously. They wouldn't have said I'm Hindu above those local practices. But when the British started setting out these censuses, people were starting to say to themselves, oh, I'm a Muslim, not a Hindu. I'm a Hindu, not a Muslim. So it created a stark divide of religion. Then curiously, the British being the British, when Indians would agitate and say, we want self-rule, we don't want you to rule us anymore, they would say, you guys can't have self-rule. You're too divided over religion. I said, well, come on, you guys, you divided us. So there's complexity there. Often Hindu nationalism is called Hindutva. I don't have this on the slide, sorry. Hindutva means Hindu-ness. This is an idea coined by a guy in the late 19th and early 20th century by the name of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Now, he was an Indian freedom fighter who was staunchly anti-Muslim, and he did not care for Gandhi, in fact, and he didn't like any of Gandhi's sort of pro-religious tolerance ideas. Savarkar wanted to completely displace the Muslims in any way they could. Intriguingly, he was a staunch atheist, a meat eater, and he refused Hindu funeral customs. In fact, it is argued by Hindu nationalists that Muslims are foreigners in India, despite the fact that Muslims have been in India for 1,000 years. These Hindu nationalists will argue that the owners of India are the Hindus, and the Muslims, no matter how long they've been here, are effectively just mere tenants renting land in the Hindu nation. They argue that India should not have been split up and Pakistan should not have been given to the Muslims. Now, they argue that Muslims are a minority and should not have any special privileges. There's quite a bit of overlap with USA affirmative action debates that we have. So when we talk about raising up different groups, such as people of color, there will often be whites that will say, no, you're a minority. You shouldn't have special privileges. So they would argue, and nationalists would argue, that any attempt to redress past oppression and social ills amounts to special privileges for these minority groups. Now, the propaganda that I hear the most from Hindu nationalists are that Muslims are prodigious breeders and they seek to overwhelm the Hindus by their sheer numbers. They'll argue that Muslims have just so many more kids than Hindus that sooner or later they will be in a Muslim majority country because the Muslims had so many children. Does this sound familiar to you? This sounds very familiar to the white racist trope in the United States about the Great Replacement, arguing that in time there will be more people of color than white folk because people of color have more children, and that will be the end of white culture. Hard pass. Anyway, so Muslims are considered a minority, so Hindus or blah, blah, blah. If Muslims become the majority, then Hindus will be forced to cater to them, to accommodate to them, to kowtow to them. Neither Muslim government nor secular government, they will argue, could ever equally govern the Hindus. So you have to have a Hindu government for Hindus to get their fair shake. And the Muslims that remain in India at this point should all just go to Pakistan. There's no reason for them to be here. Hindu fundamentalists based these ideals on the so-called rule of Ram, the Ram Raj, sort of like specifically invoking the Ramayana. Remember, at the end of the Ramayana, there's this glorious time where Rama rules everything and everybody is happy because he's a righteous king. So a lot of Hindu fundamentalists, and you'll hear them claim this in Ram Ke Naam, in the name of God, they will say that these nationalist activists see themselves as the foot soldiers of Ram, as being like Hanuman and like being like in Hanuman's monkey army. What they really seek to do, and they say this explicitly, is to establish a new Ram Raj, a new rule of Ram based on this ideal hero and king of the Ramayana, who, you know, despite his foibles, I guess he was a good ruler. But y'all have heard me rant about Rama in the past. So what we need to see here is that this is the rise of fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism really gets going around the world in the 19th and 20th century and really gets going in the 20th century. So when people talk about being fundamentalists, they say, well, what is the fundamental they get back to? And they'll say, oh, if I'm a Christian fundamentalist, we have to have a society that is like the society of Jesus, even though you point out the society of Jesus is really different from ours and would not be very pleasant for very many people. In the same way, the Hindu fundamentalists will argue that they need to go back to this glorious time of when Ram ruled, but, you know, Ram didn't rule. They will argue that the rule of Ram and the Ramayana is literally a true story and not some ideal to aspire to. They say they want to get back there. So one scholar of religion named Jeffrey Kripal defines fundamentalism in this way. It's a modern way of being religious that relies on highly selective literalist readings of an inerrant scripture and on a return to fundamentals, which they postulate are the original truths of the faith. In fact, I wouldn't even say that it's a modern way of thinking, but it's a postmodern way of thinking. In the contemporary world, people want to circle the wagons to get all of their community together and shut out the outside world and create an ideal space that is based on their common identity or religion. While people have done stuff like this since probably the dawn of time and people have ever organized themselves, a coherent movement on the scale that we see to this day of folk that want to establish fundamentalist rule is unprecedented and is very much something of our time. One thing I would like to mention is that when there is communal violence, especially between Hindus and Muslims, generally there's like 10 Muslims killed for every Hindu. When it comes to Muslim terrorist violence, one sort of confusing argument to, I think, a lot of people, they don't realize, is that the majority of, say, Muslim violence doesn't go on to other countries. It happens within their own countries. So the majority of religious violence on the part of Muslims in Pakistan is against other Muslims and is against the secular state, because they want to argue that the state should be inherently Muslim and should be dictated by Muslim law. So when you hear about religious violence, we tend to think about things like 9/11 in the United States, where a group of fundamentalist Arabs came and knocked down the two towers. So that would be an attack on the United States. But the majority of Islamic violence is not against the United States. It's not against any other country. The majority are like freedom fighters in Pakistan or in India or in Burma or wherever they are, would be Muslims trying to establish a more rigorous or more fundamentalist faith in the country where they live. So there are three key organizations to understand Hindu fundamentalism, and I'm going to go through them here. You'll have heard about these as well in the video. There is the RSS, and yes, there are a lot of acronyms here, but once you get a couple of them down, you can kind of start really being able to understand the politics as they're described in Indian newspapers. So the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, Sangh means organization, Swayamsevak means something like serving folk, and then Rashtriya means like national. So this means the National Volunteer Organization. Now the RSS is right wing. Now when I talk about right wing and left wing as a political ideology, the right argues for sort of well, the left argues for social uplift, kind of a notion of standard equality, and is working towards meeting lots of people's needs. On the right, you see hierarchy, strong central rule, and sort of I don't want to go into it too much here. Okay. You can look up right wing and left wing and figure out that whole political argument on your own, as you've done, I'm sure, in many classes to this point. So they're right wing, they're nationalists, they're a paramilitary volunteer group that promotes Hindutva or Hindu-ness. Originally, they were banned by the British because they advocated for self-rule. In fact, a member of the RSS actually assassinated Gandhi. When Gandhi was killed, he was killed by a Hindu fundamentalist. They were also made illegal very briefly in the 1990s after the destruction of the Babri Masjid, but they are back. They're very much back. Their goal is to unite Hindus, and they organize into informal groups that study, exercise, and train for combat. You can recognize them by their khaki shorts that they always wear. They are thought to bring about the manliness of Hindus. So this is an interesting problem. In the post-colonial situation, we have countries like Britain that kind of owned India. And for that time, they depicted Indian people and Indian men and other colonial subjects of them as being more feminine, less manly, more irrational, less, morally developed and whatnot. So once the colonial project ends, there's still this like hangover. And in this case, we see that there's a notion of Hindu masculinity and Hindu maleness that men have felt effeminized by the British rule. So then they want to establish a more sort of potent Indian male nature. So over time, they became very anti-Muslim, and the RSS has opposed all efforts to accommodate Muslims in the time of independence, since independence, and in the writing of the Constitution. To our surprise, in the RSS, you'll find many renunciate Hindus are members, and to some degree, renunciate Hindus dictate a lot of the policy in the RSS. The next group is called the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the Worldwide Hindu Organization. This is designated as a violent religious group by our own CEA. They believe that all religions that are connected to India or originate in India are essentially Hindus, to which, like I said, Jains, Sikhs, and Buddhists would say, no, we're not. Okay, so they're organized around implementing the ideas of the RSS through volunteer services, including medical services, education, and social welfare. And all of these medical services, education, and social welfare are accompanied by very strong anti-Muslim ideology. They are not going to be reaching out to groups they consider non-Hindu. In fact, it has a large youth outreach where they really try to get young people involved in thinking of themselves as Hindus above all things. It is found around the world, and it has an especially strong presence in the United States, where you can find the VHP sort of arguments in not only curriculum that was designed in temples. So like people were running a temple and like, well, we don't have a Sunday school curriculum. We don't have a religious studies professor to come in and teach us. And none of us have had Sunday school or religious classes. We're just engineers and doctors and whatever we are. So how are we going to teach our kids what it means to be Hindu? Because we don't need to learn what it means to be Hindu. We're just Hindu. We don't think about it. And now we're living in the United States. So they go to adopt sort of like curriculums written by other Indians to explain Hinduism. And what they don't realize is a lot of it is very politically informed. And the VHP has developed these curriculums and will often provide them very, very cheaply to not just temples that want to have a little Sunday school, but also to Hindu groups on college campuses. So you can find this if you go into a lot of Hindu groups, you'll find these weird things that'll come up. Like they'll get a lot of emails from organizations in India and in the US with connections to political organizations. And what that is it's politicians and political thinkers trying to influence youth in the United States to be good Hindu fundamentalists. Now, the VHP had quite a few active representatives during this Babri Masjid controversy that I'll talk to in a minute. One of their main goals is to reconvert Hindus. They have this idea that everybody was a Hindu and they converted to other religions. So if anybody's a Christian, then you got to get them to reconvert back to Hinduism. It's hard to separate out the VHP from the RSS, and a lot of the members sort of overlap. So these folks were the ones that cooked up and spread the idea that the Babri Masjid was built on an ancient temple that was originally built to celebrate the birthplace of Lord Ram. Finally, you have the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the party of the Indian people. This is the political arm of Hindu fundamentalism. So if the RSS and the VHP were ideological, this is explicitly engaged in politics. So this is the political arm of Hindu fundamentalism. And since the 1990s, they have gained more and more and more local and national power in India. And it's challenged that organization I told you about before, the Indian National Congress, which these days is in shambles. They are anti-Muslim, either explicitly or implicitly. They are overtly Hindu. The contemporary Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is a member of the BJP. And we're seeing around India that, especially in places where sort of communism, like in the East and in the Southwest, are well established. In the areas where communism is not well established, the BJP is just gobbling up everything. And it appears that they are going to be in power for quite some time now, which, has its challenges. So the BJP provided political muscle to the VHP and their vision on the Ram Janmabhoomi. So when it was time to tear down the masjid and build a new temple, the ideological powers couldn't quite get there. So they got these politicians involved. Now we're going to see, there's a character named L.K. Advani, and we see him in the documentary. And in the 1990s, he went on what he called a chariot tour of India. So he dressed up this truck, kind of looked like a chariot, and he went around and gathered up local politicians and had all these sort of rallies trying to, tell people that, the Muslims had destroyed this glorious Ram temple, just like the Muslims were trying to destroy everything. And they needed to get up and agitate and take their country back. So he was actually imprisoned for starting violence. If you look at this picture below in black and white, you'll see a familiar face that is circled. That is the contemporary Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, on L.K. Advani's chariot. And they were going around and agitating for, and basically, inspiring violence of Hindus against Muslims. So like I said, the Babri Masjid. Yeah, let me one other thing. Their goal was to amongst the BJP is to restore the respect and glorious unified Hindu culture. They used the Ram Janambhoomi, this temple where Ram was supposedly born, as an example of their vision. And it's a popular rallying cry for Hindutva folk. And as you'll see in the video, the majority of people that came and tore down the Babri Masjid were not from Ayodhya. It was Hindus that had been agitated around the country by people like L.K. Advani to come to Ayodhya and tear down the mosque. Now, if it seems like these groups, the BJP, the VHP, and the RSS overlap, well, you're right, they do. There's a lot of overlap, and a lot of people are members, Hindu fundamentalists are members in all of these organizations. Okay, so what is this Babri Masjid? And I want to just kind of go over the timeline and give you a little bit of the history. So the Babri Masjid, and masjid is the sort of, it's another word for a mosque, was a 16th century mosque, so it was built in the 1600s, in the town of Ayodhya. Now, you remember in the Ramayana, the hometown of Rama was Ayodhya. However, it is not clear by any means from archaeology or from textual research into the Ramayana that the contemporary town of Ayodhya is identical to the Ayodhya in the story. Okay, so in the Ramayana, the god Ram or Rama is born in some town called Ayodhya, though probably it was not exactly this town that we're talking about here. Now, Hindu fundamentalists in the 1990s tore down the mosque and vowed to build a Ram Janambhoomi temple that is dedicated to the birthplace of the god Ram. Now, problematically, and I've given you some archaeology, a short piece written by a number of archaeologists and Indian academics, archaeology has found that there was a 10th century shrine underneath the mosque, but there's no clear indication that the god that it was dedicated to the god Rama. In fact, at that time, in the year 1000 CE, there were no temples to the god Ram. So that's a relatively recent, in the past couple hundred years, have we seen temples to Rama. We don't have ancient temples to Rama by any means, despite what fundamentalists say. We think likely that it was a Jain site because Ayodhya was a very prominent Jain location for much of its history. This the mosque itself, so it's a temple town, and blah blah blah. I got ahead of myself. Yes, so like I said, Ayodhya has been a temple town for quite a long time. Earlier writings and inscriptions and foreign travelers, such as the Buddhists who visited India, write about that Ayodhya was a Buddhist or Jain place, but they don't mention any discussion of like when they came in the 4th century and the 6th century. We don't see any writings by Buddhist pilgrims about Ayodhya being a center of even Hinduism. Okay, so when we're talking about the town of Ayodhya and the Ramayana, as I said, you cannot really clearly identify where it really was. We think it was likely far to the west and south of modern Ayodhya. It's not, but most likely was not contemporary Ayodhya. The majorities of Rama temples, in fact, as we look around Ayodhya and we look at Rama temples, we'll see that they were sponsored and patronized by Muslim rulers because this whole area was under Muslim rule for centuries after centuries after centuries up until Indian independence. So in fact, we see that many of these temples were in fact built by, or funds were given for them to be built by, Muslim rulers. So the association of this particular area with the god Rama only comes around 1300s. So it was only in the 1300s that we see Rama start being really popular and worshipped in temples. Now, we see after the 1600s, we see a lot of Rama temples come up, and that can be corresponded to the writing of the Ramcharitmanas in 1574. Now, the Ramcharitmanas is a version of the Ramayana written in a very early form of Hindi. And the majority of Indians who interact with the Ramayana stories are more likely to read this Ramcharitmanas than they would to read the Valmiki in the Sanskrit, because, well, Sanskrit's hard. And the story is much more simplified, and a lot of Rama's problematic nature is resolved in the Ramcharitmanas. I like to show these two pictures because through the 1970s, the most common picture of Rama would be this Rama here on the left, looking like a normal sized man, sweetly hugging Hanuman, his beloved devotee. These days, when you see Rama, he looks like an action hero and a bodybuilder. And there's been a bunch of really interesting art history noting that the gods in the late 20th century suddenly got swollen and big and muscular. They became like He-Man characters, when previously they would be depicted like sort of normal human beings. Okay. There's a long tradition of peaceful coexistence in the temple town of Ayodhya, and the sort of violence that we see now and religious intolerance is relatively recent. In fact, it was likely the British, in fact, the Jesuits, the Jesuit order in particular, who argued there was originally a Hindu temple at the Babri Masjid. Why did they argue that? I don't really know, but they were convinced, and now Hindu fundamentalists are convinced. The British, in fact, erected a wall in the mosque so that Hindus could pray on one side and Muslims could pray on the other. So yes, up to the time the Babri Masjid was demolished, there were no active Muslim services there. There were active Hindu worship practices. So in fact, when those Hindu fundamentalists came and tore down the Babri Masjid, they were in fact tearing down a temple where people were actively worshiping Ram. So once again, they had no idea what was going on in the local context. Now, in this way, there's a long-standing tradition of the mosque and the Rama temple mutually occupying the same space. So in 1949, a man had a vision of a young Rama playing in the temple. Soon after that, a new image appeared. In fact, there was a priest at that temple that admitted, in the area, that admitted that he had placed the images. So what is said to be a vision that someone had, and then the miraculous appearance of a special Ram image, well, you know, I'm sure that guy did have that vision, sure. But the arrival of this magical image of Ram was a human being admitted to doing it. It was no miracle. Okay, post-independence, and independence from the British happened in 1947. There were high tensions in the area because with partition and with the splitting of India into India and Pakistan 1 and 2, there was quite a bit of communal violence, and a lot of violence targeted Muslims. So tension was high after the independence. So the pujari, or the priest who would oversee the Rama temple here, was court appointed. So the government appointed a specific priest there. And in fact, the priest at the time of this conflict, who you see interviewed and was later killed, was a communist. So he had no truck with the Hindu fundamentalists. In fact, the temple community, they argue, was doing just fine. The priest notes that none of these VHP and BJP politicians ever came by and worshiped at this temple. He said, we're doing our temple thing here. We have a thriving community. All these politicians that are agitating for how oppressed we are and how we need to tear down this temple, we need to tear down this mosque, establish this temple, none of them come and worship here with our community and worship the images that we have. And you know, he's like, I'm the priest. Advani has not come here. Narendra Modi has not come here. Okay, so there was a group of historians in 1990, which was a few years before the temple demolition, presented a full case in the press about the history and archaeology of the site. They argued it is appropriate, therefore, and this was their solution, it is appropriate, therefore, that a political solution is urgently found. Rama Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid area be demarcated and declared a national monument. They argued that the communities that claimed this place as either Hindu or Muslim would lead to communal violence. So the best bet would be to just declare the place a national monument, give it a Hindu name and a Muslim name together, and just leave it alone, which would have been nice. These historians were correct. In 1990, Kar Sevaks, so volunteers, they were called Kar Sevaks, those who are doing their duty, advanced on the temple, and a mostly Hindu police force started smashing up the walls. And in fact, 6 Hindus ended up being killed in violent skirmishes with the police. Furthermore, in 1992, and this is when the big thing happened, after a huge victory by the BJP in the political arena, the VHP inspired Hindus to storm the mosque and tear it down. Now, the strange thing was, up until recently, up until 2020, for 30 years, nothing really happened at that site. Until recently. I'll get to that in a second. So, in the 1990s, we see that there were quite a few riots that were religious riots. Now, in 1992, communal riots happened immediately after they tore down the Babri Masjid, and 2,000 people were killed. 6 weeks later, there was another riot in faraway Bombay, and 900 people were killed. Some Muslim fundamentalists have been enlivened by this activity, by the burning down. So when I'm talking about this violence, this is mostly Muslims that were killed. However, there was a Muslim fundamentalist who had a bombing in Bombay that killed 257 people, and he said he did it because of the Babri Masjid. Now, in Gujarat in the early 2000s, there was a train fire that was likely an accident, but it was said that the Muslims had started a fire on the train to target Hindus. This is not the case. We actually think it was a faulty pressure cooker or something that exploded. In this, 2,000 people were killed as a result of these rumors that Hindus had firebombed this train car, or that Muslims had firebombed this train car to kill Hindus. 2,000 people were killed, and 150,000 people were displaced during this. Most of them were Muslims. At the time, the government of Gujarat was led by now President Narendra Modi, and he looked the other way and might have even been complicit in the violence that occurred. Recently, in 2020, there were the so-called Delhi riots in which Hindu mobs attacked Muslims and 53 people were killed. 2/3 of the people killed were Muslims. This overlapped with a visit from then President Donald Trump, who was shielded from witnessing what was going on. It was really strange because I remember was reading about it, and there was all this violence happening in Delhi. And at the same time, Donald Trump was in India, and he was in Delhi, but they'd show like, they would only take him in like the nicest parts of town and make sure he wasn't near anything violent going on, as fits it. And Trump would like give lectures and be like, this is just the most amazing country in the world. I'm like, meanwhile, in Delhi, like a few miles away, bodies are burning. So it was really a strange time. Now, what's going on? Why was this riot started? Well, it was actually started by a sit-in which women were protesting the BJP's attempt to remove citizenships of Muslims. This Citizen Amendment Act would have fast-tracked non-Muslim migrants and refugees. The idea was to say that all Muslims had to demonstrate that they were inherently Indian and thereby citizens by demonstrating where they come from and whatnot. And then anybody who was coming in as a refugee, as long as they weren't a Muslim, they would become Indian citizens really fast. So it was a government move to strip many Muslims of their Indian citizenship, making them effectively refugees in their own countries where they lived for generation after generation after generation. It was a power grab, and the sit-in and demonstrations against these legal changes are what caused the violence in 2020. So where are we now? Where are the after effects of this? As of the summer of 2020, endorsed by BJP Prime Minister Narendra Modi, groups have started building the Ram Janmabhoomi Shrine. This land was undeveloped for 30 years, and they've started building the temple now. The American VHP, the version of the VHP that's found in the United States, which is supported by Modi, actually advertised for the Ram Janmabhoomi, the temple at the birthplace of Ram, and the inauguration in the beginning of building the temple. They advertised this in a prominent area in Times Square, New York City, and there was a lot of revolt against this because this was Hindu fundamentalists making a Hindu fundamentalist argument justifying the destruction of the masjid and the building of a new Hindu temple there. Now, one of the weird things is throughout those 30 years, a lot of Hindu fundamentalist groups would collect money, of course, to build the temple, most of which they siphoned off in a corrupt manner. But one of their scams was to sell bricks. So what would happen is at the site where the temple is now being built, you'd have just like these huge donations of tons and tons and tons of bricks. And evidently, you can walk around in Ayodhya, and you can see all of these bricks in like people's houses and buildings built with them that have the name Ram written on them, because folks stole the bricks in the middle of the night and used them to build their own houses. So it was all a bit of a kerfuffle all around. There was incredible corruption regarding the distribution of these donations and people filtering off donated money for themselves. At a certain point, the national banks of India refused to process any international donations that was brought in by the VHP, because the VHP was considered linked to violence and the organization was thought to cause violence. The people who live in Ayodhya feel betrayed all around. I mean, Hindu nationalists throughout India rally behind the temple, but the people of Ayodhya are like, build the darn temple, don't tear down the mosque. Why are you screwing with this so bad? This is all so corrupt. So the locals are, for the most part, not behind the building of the Rama temple. So in this sense, the translocal political situation of Hindu fundamentalists really does affect the little town of Ayodhya that's been put through the ringer and had quite a bit of violence and conflict there. The building of this temple to Ram, so like I'd said, here is, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Here is the VHP sort of advertisements in Times Square that a lot of people revolted against. Like I said, look at all these bricks. They all say Sri Rama on them. And people would donate a lot of stuff, but nothing really happened for 30 years. Okay, so the building of the temple to Ram and the destruction of the masjid are continuing touchstones for populist appeal by politicians. Hindu fundamentalists invoke this stuff all along, all the time, in order to get Hindus sort of whipped up and excited. The narrative remains that the Muslims destroyed the glorious Hindu culture and they unmanned the Hindus. They made Hindus unmanly. There is anger at the British, who actually did that, but the real rage is saved for Muslims. It is arguable that the British actually exasperated communal tensions and their desire to rule a divided India. And they regularly argued that Indians could not self-rule because of their divisions over religion. Arguably, their situations with religion and religious conflict was caused by the British. In reality, India is not India without Muslim culture. Muslim culture brings the food, the music, and the architecture. They would not be the same. And the food, the music, and the architecture is kind of the best stuff about India. There have also been many, many Muslim politicians who have demonstrated that they could evenly and well rule Hindus. So Hindus are regularly saying, despite them being in the majority, that they need to have Hindu rule in order that Hindus would be treated fairly. But there have been tons of Muslim rulers and Sikh rulers and presidents and prime ministers that have all done a fine job and have not oppressed Hindus in any way. And it is kind of tricky to oppress a super majority. Remember that, like, roughly, roughly 80% of India is Hindu. The majority of great Bollywood stars and music composers for Bollywood music are, in fact, Muslims. Look at your Shah Rukh Khans of the world, who are all Muslims. All of the many Khans are Muslims. Amir Khan and Salman Khan. My favorite, Shah Rukh Khan. I kind of like Salman Khan. Okay. The problem is, everything goes off the rails in India when Indian nationalism was abandoned in favor of Hindu nationalism. So you go from an earlier time in the 20th century when there were quite a few Indian nationalists and they wanted self-rule and all Indians to do well. Now, what happened was in the 20th century that Indian nationalism shifted to be purely Hindu nationalism that says we got to get rid of the Muslims or oppress the Muslims and make sure Hinduism is the top thing, and that the religion of the country should be Hindu and the national religion should be Hindu and the government should all be Hindu. So what I want you to remember is this difference between Indian nationalism, looking out for all Hindus, or for all Indians, and Hindu nationalism, looking out for only Hindus. And I must ask, Does anything sound familiar here? When you watch or if you have already watched the documentary Ram Ke Naam, the stories about this Muslim rule, stories about this mosque being built on top of a Hindu temple, it does sound a little familiar to the QAnon conspiracy theories that were almost completely baseless, inspiring people to go and vandalize the US Capitol. Well, here, baseless claims about a Muslim mosque being built on an originally Hindu temple were stoked for years and years until Hindus went and tore down a mosque. So there are some similarities. Kick the idea around a little bit. All right. So that was the last of the dark days of Hinduism. We're on to gurus next. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.